Have you ever felt the sting of someone looking at you and deciding in just one glance that you weren't enough? Not pretty enough, not young enough, not whatever enough they were seeking? Today's story will break your heart before it mends it again. It's about a woman who traveled 1,000 miles on nothing but a promise, only to discover that promises can shatter like glass when they hit the hard ground of reality. But sometimes, when one door slams shut, another opens, not by magic, but because there's someone on the other side who sees what others have missed. This is the story of Maggie Sullivan, a mail-order bride whose journey west didn't end the way she'd planned. It ended better. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Spring was washing over Massachusetts in waves of pale green when Maggie Sullivan made the decision that would change everything. At 35, she'd spent the last decade teaching other people's children in a small Concord schoolhouse, returning each evening to the modest room she rented from the widow Hayes. The children brought her joy, their curious minds and innocent questions a balm for her own quiet loneliness. But lately, she'd begun to feel the weight of time pressing down, the years slipping by with nothing to mark them but the changing seasons and the gradual progression of her students from childhood to adulthood. Maggie wasn't what people called a beauty. Her auburn hair had begun to thread with silver, and the lines around her eyes told stories of laughter and squinting in sunlight while reading on the schoolhouse steps. She had never been delicate or dainty. Her hands were capable and strong, from years of writing on chalkboards and tending her small garden. But there was a warmth in her green eyes that drew people in, a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself through town with her worn leather satchel of books and papers. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the postman who'd known Maggie since she was a girl herself. "Another response to your advertisement, Miss Sullivan," he'd said, tipping his hat with a smile that held no judgment. Maggie had been corresponding with potential suitors for nearly 6 months, ever since she'd placed the advertisement in a frontier newspaper. Teacher of good character and gentle disposition seeks correspondence with a respectable gentleman of the Western Territories, with view to matrimony. Most of the replies had been brief, disappointing, or occasionally alarming, but Thomas Blackwell's letters had been different. A cattle rancher from Pine Ridge, Colorado, he wrote of needing a sensible woman to bring warmth and learning to a growing town. His penmanship was neat, his thoughts well-ordered. Over 3 months and 7 exchanges, Maggie had built a picture of the man and the life that awaited her. A modest ranch house that needed a woman's touch, a town eager for someone to educate its children, and a man who valued character and intelligence over frivolous beauty. This final letter contained his proposal and funds for her journey west. "I believe we could build something meaningful together," he'd written. "Pine Ridge needs a school teacher, and I need a partner to share in what I've built. If you find these terms agreeable, I await your arrival with anticipation." Maggie had read the letter a dozen times, tracing the words with her fingertip as though they might reveal hidden meanings between the carefully formed letters. That night, she'd stood before her small mirror, studying her reflection with unusual intensity. The face that looked back at her was familiar, kind but careworn, with a sprinkling of freckles across her nose that had never faded with age. She wasn't young anymore. But perhaps, she thought, that didn't matter so much in places where survival demanded more than youth and beauty. "A chance," she whispered to her reflection. "One last chance for something of my own." The following weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. Maggie resigned from her teaching position, sold what little furniture she owned, and packed her most precious possessions into a single trunk: her mother's silver locket, dog-eared books that had been her companions through lonely evenings, the quilt she'd stitched with state flowers, each representing a place she'd once dreamed of visiting. She said goodbye to her students, some of whom cried, and presented her with small tokens to remember them by. The widow Hayes had hugged her tightly on her last evening in Concord. "You deserve happiness, Margaret Sullivan," the older woman had said fiercely. "Don't you settle for anything less, you hear me? Not after coming this far." The journey west was longer than Maggie had imagined possible. First by train to Chicago, then changing to the Union Pacific headed toward Denver, and finally a 2-day stagecoach journey to Pine Ridge. The further west they traveled, the more the landscape transformed, familiar forests and fields giving way to vast expanses that made her feel tiny and exposed beneath an endless sky. The other passengers came and went, most avoiding conversation beyond polite nods. Maggie spent the hours watching the changing world outside the window and wondering who she might become in this new place so far from everything she'd known. Pine Ridge appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a cluster of wooden buildings nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind them like guardians of stone and pine. The stagecoach rattled down the main street, passing the general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a small white church, and various other establishments that composed the frontier town. Maggie gathered her shawl around her shoulders as the coach came to a stop, her heart beating so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The station was little more than a covered platform beside the general store. Maggie stepped down, carefully smoothing her travel-worn dress with palms that betrayed her nervousness. She thanked the driver as he set her trunk beside her, then stood scanning the scattered people for a man who might be Thomas Blackwell. She waited 10 minutes, then 20. A few townsfolk passed by, eyeing her with curious glances but offering no greeting. The sun beat down with an intensity she wasn't accustomed to, and Maggie found herself moving her trunk into the narrow shade offered by the platform's overhang. After nearly an hour, just as uncertainty was beginning to gnaw at her confidence, a man approached from the direction of the saloon. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered and sun-browned, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that reminded her of a winter sky. Clear blue, but somehow cold. His clothes were well made, his boots polished. This was a man who took pride in his appearance. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked, stopping several feet away. Maggie nodded, attempting a smile despite the knot of tension in her stomach. "Mr. Blackwell? Thomas?" He didn't return her smile. Instead, his gaze moved over her in a slow, appraising way that made her wish she'd had the opportunity to change from her travel clothes. "You're older than I expected," he said without preamble, his tone matter-of-fact rather than intentionally cruel. The words landed like a physical blow. Maggie's smile faltered, but she kept her chin up. "I believe I mentioned my age in our correspondence. 35 this past winter." Thomas frowned slightly. "The photograph you sent, it must have been from some years ago." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks. The photograph had been taken just before she'd placed the advertisement, though the lighting had been kind. "I assure you it was recent," she said, her voice growing quieter. He sighed, glancing around as though hoping for a different woman to appear and claim his name. "Well, you're here now. We should get you settled." He reached for her trunk, lifting it with ease and turning back toward the main street. "My ranch is a few miles outside town. I've arranged a room for you at the boarding house until what, he didn't say, but Maggie could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. Until he decided whether she would do after all. Until he determined if a woman, past the first bloom of youth, was worth marrying. The thought sent a chill through her despite the warm spring air. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a small porch and window boxes filled with hardy geraniums. The proprietress, a stout woman named Mrs. Fletcher, greeted them with polite curiosity, showing Maggie to a small but clean room on the 2nd floor. Thomas set down her trunk and stood awkwardly near the door. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said, We can discuss arrangements." After he left, Maggie sank onto the narrow bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The room was plain: a bed, a washstand, a small table with a lamp and a single chair by the window. Through the thin curtains, she could see the main street of Pine Ridge, people moving about their business in the late afternoon light. She was 1,000 miles from home, in a town where she knew no one, having spent nearly every cent she had on the journey. That night, Maggie could barely sleep, her mind racing with uncertainty. She unpacked a few necessities, carefully hanging her 2 good dresses in the small wardrobe, hoping the wrinkles would release overnight. In the morning, she washed and dressed with special care, pinning her hair in a style that softened her features and choosing her blue dress that had always drawn compliments back in Concord. Thomas arrived shortly before noon. If he noticed her efforts, he gave no indication. They walked in strained silence to a small cafe at the end of the street, where he ordered coffee for them both. Once the waitress had left, he folded his hands on the table and met Maggie's gaze directly. "Miss Sullivan," he began, his voice low but clear, "I find myself in an uncomfortable position. I agreed to this arrangement believing you to be younger." He cleared his throat. "I require a wife who can bear children, you understand, to continue the Blackwell name and help with the running of the ranch as my business grows." Maggie's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "Many women my age have children, Mr. Blackwell." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but the risk increases. And frankly, Miss Sullivan, this is a harsh land that demands vitality and strength. I'm not convinced I possess those qualities." Maggie finished for him, a surprising steadiness in her voice despite the shame burning through her. Thomas had the grace to look slightly discomfited. "You seem a fine woman, well-spoken and educated. But I've been building my ranch for 7 years now. I need to think of its future, of my future." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. "This should cover your return journey to Massachusetts. I'll speak to the stagecoach driver about a seat on tomorrow's eastbound coach." The finality of it struck Maggie like a physical blow. She stared at the envelope, unable to reach for it. "And if I choose not to return to Massachusetts?" Thomas frowned. "This is a small town, Miss Sullivan. There aren't many opportunities for a woman alone." "I'm a teacher," she said, a hint of steel entering her voice. "Every growing town needs education for its children." He shifted uncomfortably. "The town council has been discussing a school, but there's no proper building, yet no funds allocated." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I truly am sorry for the misunderstanding, Miss Sullivan. I wish you the best of whatever you decide." And then he was gone, leaving Maggie alone with an untouched cup of coffee and an envelope containing her journey back to a life she'd already left behind. She sat there for what felt like hours, watching the people of Pine Ridge pass by the window. Women with market baskets, men in work clothes, children darting between adults on mysterious errands of their own. This was to have been her town. These people, her neighbors. That man, her husband. Now she was simply a stranger passing through, a curiosity that would soon be forgotten. When she finally left the cafe, Maggie didn't return to the boarding house. Instead, she walked slowly through Pine Ridge, taking in the settlement that might have been her home. The town was larger than it had first appeared. Beyond the main street were scattered houses, small garden plots, a livery stable, and what looked like the beginnings of a schoolhouse, little more than a foundation and frame so far. She paused there, imagining the building completed, filled with the voices of children eager to learn. As the afternoon sun began to lower, Maggie found herself at the edge of town. where a small creek bubbled over stones on its way to join some larger river. She sat on its bank, removing her shoes to let her tired feet dangle in the cool water. The tears she'd been holding back all day finally came, not in the dramatic sobs of a young girl, but in the quiet, dignified weeping of a woman who had gambled everything on one last chance and lost. "Dangerous place to be sitting alone, Mom." The voice startled her. Maggie hurriedly wiped her eyes, turning to find a man standing a respectful distance away. He was older than Thomas Blackwell, perhaps in his early 50s, with hair the color of tarnished silver and a face weathered by sun and wind into a map of lines and creases. Unlike Thomas's calculated neatness, this man wore practical work clothes. The sleeves of his faded shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle earned through years of labor. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said, his voice gentler than his rugged appearance suggested. "But mountain lions have been known to come down to the creek at dusk." Maggie quickly pulled her feet from the water, reaching for her shoes. "I didn't know," she said, embarrassed to be caught crying. "I'm not familiar with the dangers here." "New to Pine Ridge?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question in a town small enough that any stranger would be immediately noticed. She nodded, slipping her feet back into her shoes. "Just arrived yesterday." The man seemed to be waiting for more explanation, but when Maggie offered none, he simply nodded. "Sam Wilson," he said. "I've got a ranch north of town." "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, the formality of introductions providing a momentary refuge from her turmoil. "Though most call me Maggie." "You planning to stay in Pine Ridge, Miss Sullivan?" he asked, shrewd eyes noting her reddened eyes and the defeat in her posture. Maggie looked back toward the town, golden now in the late afternoon light. "I haven't decided," she said finally. It wasn't quite a lie. She hadn't decided when she would leave or where she would go with her limited funds, only that there was nothing for her here. Sam Wilson studied her face a moment longer than was comfortable, then gestured back toward town. "Best head back before dark. If you're staying, you'll learn the rhythms of this place soon enough. When to be cautious, when to be bold." Something in his tone, not pitying but understanding, touched Maggie deeply. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Wilson." He tipped his hat. "Ma'am." As they walked back toward Pine Ridge in companionable silence, Maggie found herself wondering about this silver-haired rancher who had interrupted her moment of despair with practical concerns about mountain lions. There was a steadiness to him that reminded her of the old oak tree outside the Concord schoolhouse, weathered and scarred by lightning, but still standing strong, roots deep in the soil. She didn't know it then, but Sam Wilson would come to mean more to her than the man she'd traveled 1,000 miles to marry. Sometimes life's greatest gifts arrive disguised as disappointments, and the end of one dream can be the beginning of another, one far better than we ever dared imagine for ourselves. The walk back to town with Sam Wilson was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Maggie found herself matching her steps to his unhurried pace, the evening breeze carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. As they reached the edge of Pine Ridge's main street, Sam paused. "The boarding house is just there," he said, nodding, toward the two-story building where Maggie had spent the previous night. "Mrs. Fletcher serves a decent supper at 6 if you've not made other arrangements." "Thank you," Maggie replied, suddenly reluctant to part from the only person who'd shown her genuine kindness since her arrival, for the warning about mountain lions, and to shade the company back to town. Sam studied her face for a moment, and Maggie had the distinct impression he was seeing far more than she wished to reveal. "Town can be a lonely place when you're new," he said finally. "Folks here aren't unkind, just cautious with strangers. Give them time." Time was precisely what Maggie didn't have, with Thomas's money for a return ticket burning a hole in her pocket and no clear path forward. But she merely nodded, unwilling to burden this stranger with her troubles. "Good evening, Mr. Wilson," she said, forcing a small smile. He tipped his hat again. "Miss Sullivan." Then he turned and continued, down the street, his unhurried stride carrying him toward the general store. Supper at the boarding house was a quiet affair. Besides Maggie, there were only two other guests, a traveling salesman who spoke at length about his collection of patented household gadgets, and a young man waiting for a land grant approval. Mrs. Fletcher, despite her initially brusque manner, proved to be an excellent cook, serving a hearty stew with fresh-baked bread that reminded Maggie how little she'd eaten that day. "Will Mr. Blackwell be joining you this evening?" Mrs. Fletcher asked as she cleared the plates, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with curiosity. Maggie set down her napkin, aware of the other guests' attention suddenly focused on her. "No," she said simply. "Mr. Blackwell and I have concluded our business." Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly, but she asked no further questions. The traveling salesman launched into another tale about a marvelous egg-beating device he'd sold to a banker's wife in Denver, and the moment passed. That night, Maggie sat by the small window in her room, watching as Pine Ridge settled into darkness, windows glowing with lamplight before gradually extinguishing one by one. She removed the envelope from her dress pocket, counting the money Thomas had provided. It was enough for the return journey, with perhaps a little left over, but not enough to establish herself here without immediate employment. And what waited? For her back in Concord. Her teaching position had already been filled, her few possessions sold, her room rented to another boarder. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with endless train journeys and faceless men who turned away from her in disappointment. She woke before dawn, her decision made in that quiet space between dreaming and waking. She would not return to Massachusetts. Not yet. She would give Pine Ridge 1 week, 7 days, to determine if there was a place for her here. If not, she would travel to Denver, where a larger city might offer more opportunities for a woman alone. Maggie dressed with care, selecting her second-best dress, a forest green that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinning her hair in a simpler style better suited to the western town. After a quick breakfast of porridge and strong coffee, she set out to explore Pine Ridge properly, this time with purpose rather than despair guiding her steps. The town was already bustling despite the early hour. Wagons creaked down the main street, delivering goods to the various businesses. A group of men gathered outside the sheriff's office, discussing what sounded like cattle prices and water rights. Women moved between the general store and the butcher's shop, baskets over their arms, exchanging news in hushed voices. Maggie made her way to what she'd identified the day before as the beginnings of a schoolhouse. In the morning light, she could see that construction had clearly stalled. The frame was weathering without the protection of walls or a roof, and tall grasses grew between the foundation stones. She circled the structure, mentally calculating what would be needed to complete it. "Been sitting that way for near 6 months now," came a voice behind her. Maggie turned to find a woman approximately her own age, watching her with frank curiosity. She was tall and angular, with capable hands and a face more handsome than pretty, her dark hair streaked with grey and pulled back in a practical bun. "What happened?" Maggie asked, gesturing to the abandoned construction. "Money ran out," the woman said with a shrug. "Or interest did, depends who you ask." She stepped forward, extending a hand. "Harriet Miller. I run the dress shop on Pine Street." "Margaret Sullivan," Maggie replied, taking the offered hand and finding the grip firm and confident. "Though I prefer Maggie." "You're the woman who came for Thomas Blackwell," Harriet said without preamble. It wasn't a question. Maggie stiffened slightly. "News travels quickly here," Harriet snorted, a surprisingly inelegant sound from such a composed woman. "Pine Ridge has 2 primary industries, cattle and gossip. Both can trample you if you're not careful." She gestured toward the abandoned schoolhouse. "You were a teacher, I heard." I am a teacher, Maggie corrected gently. 15 years in Concord, Massachusetts. Something flickered in Harriet's eyes, interest, perhaps even respect. And now, Maggie looked back at the unfinished structure. Now I'm considering my options. Harriet studied her for a long moment, then nodded as though coming to a decision. I'm heading to the cafe for coffee. Join me. The Bluebird Cafe sat at the corner of Pine Ridge's main street, its large windows offering a view of the town's comings and goings. Inside, the aroma of coffee and fresh pastries wrapped around Maggie like a comforting blanket. Several tables were occupied by men in work clothes, and a few women gathered near the back, their conversation pausing briefly as Harriet led Maggie to a small table by the window. "Martha," Harriet called to the plump woman behind the counter. "Coffee for 2, and some of those cinnamon rolls if you've got any left." Martha nodded, her curious gaze lingering on Maggie before she turned to fill the order. "So," Harriet said once they were seated, "Thomas Blackwell decided you weren't suitable." The bluntness of the statement nearly made Maggie flinch. "Mr. Blackwell and I had a misunderstanding regarding expectations." Harriet's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "Thomas Blackwell expects a 20-year-old who'll bear him 6 sons and never express an opinion of her own. You're better off without him." Martha arrived with their coffee and 2 enormous cinnamon rolls still warm from the oven. She set them down without comment, but her eyes were keen with interest. "Thank you, Martha," Harriet said pointedly, and the woman retreated, though not without a backward glance. Maggie wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup. "I appreciate your candor, Mrs. Miller, but Miss," Harriet corrected. "And please call me Harriet. We don't stand on formality much out here, especially among women. There are few enough of us as it is." Maggie nodded, feeling a small tension release in her shoulders. "Harriet, then, and I'm Maggie." "So, Maggie," Harriet continued, breaking off a piece of her cinnamon roll, "what's your plan now that Thomas has proven himself a fool?" The question was asked so matter-of-factly that Maggie found herself answering honestly. "I don't have one exactly. I've given myself a week to determine if there's a place for me here. If not..." She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Harriet considered this. "The town needs a school," she said finally. "Most families with young children have been teaching them at home as best they can, but it's not ideal. Some of the ranching families have hired tutors, but that's not an option for most folks here." "The building isn't finished," Maggie pointed out. "Buildings can be completed," Harriet replied. "Funding can be found. What can't be conjured out of thin air is a qualified teacher willing to live in a place like Pine Ridge." She leaned forward, slightly. "The town council meets tonight at the church. If you're serious about staying, that would be the place to make your case." Hope flickered in Maggie's chest for the first time since Thomas Blackwell had looked at her with disappointment in the cafe. Would they listen to a stranger? "They'll listen to anyone who might solve a problem they've been arguing about for months," Harriet assured her. "Besides, Pine Ridge is growing. The silver mine reopened last year. The railroad spur is finally connecting us to the main line, and more families arrive every month. We need a school, and they know it." They finished their coffee, and Harriet insisted on paying over Maggie's protests. "Consider it an investment in Pine Ridge's future," she said with a wink. "My shop is just down the street if you need anything, or simply want to talk. Women need allies out here." As Harriet departed, Maggie remained at the table, mind racing with possibilities. The council meeting was a chance, perhaps her only chance, to secure a place in this community. She would need to be prepared, persuasive, and above all, confident in what she could offer. The unfinished schoolhouse had kindled something in her, a sense of purpose that had been missing in those final months in Concord, when she'd begun dreaming of a different life. She spent the afternoon in her room at the boarding house, drafting notes for her presentation to the council, planning curriculum outlines, and calculating rough estimates of what would be required to complete the schoolhouse. By the time the church bell rang 6 times, signaling the evening hour, Maggie had filled several pages with her neat, precise handwriting and felt more herself than she had since receiving Thomas's first letter. The church was a simple white, clapboard building with a modest steeple, its double doors standing open to welcome the evening breeze. Maggie hesitated on the steps, suddenly aware of how bold her plan was. A stranger, a woman rejected by one of the town's established ranchers, proposing to take charge of the community's children and requesting the funds to complete an abandoned project. For a moment, her courage wavered. "Evening, Miss Sullivan." The familiar voice steadied her. Sam Wilson stood a few feet away, his silver hair neatly combed, his usual work clothes replaced by a clean shirt and jacket that, while not new, had been pressed with care. "Mr. Wilson," she replied, relieved to see a friendly face. "Are you attending the council meeting as well?" He nodded, moving to stand beside her on the church steps. "I try to make most of them. Town's changing fast. Best to keep informed." He studied her face with those perceptive eyes. "You look like a woman with a purpose tonight." Maggie clutched her notes a little tighter. "I suppose I am." Sam seemed about to say more when voices approached from behind them. 3 men climbed the steps, nodding to Sam with varying degrees of warmth. The oldest of them, white-haired and stooped, but with keen eyes, paused. "Wilson," he said in greeting, then turned his attention to Maggie. "Don't believe we've met, ma'am. Judge Elijah Montgomery." "Margaret Sullivan," Maggie replied, offering her hand, which the judge took with a courtly nod. "Miss Sullivan is new to Pine Ridge," Sam explained, "arrived just yesterday." The judge's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "Indeed. Well, welcome to our little town, Miss Sullivan. You're attending the council meeting?" "Yes, sir," Maggie said, straightening her shoulders slightly. "I have a matter I'd like to present to the council, if that's permitted." "We generally allow time for town business at the end of the agenda," Judge Montgomery said, his tone neither encouraging nor discouraging. "You're welcome to wait and make your case then." The 2 men with him had already disappeared into the church, but the judge lingered, curiosity evident in his expression. "May I ask what business brings you to our council, Miss Sullivan?" "The schoolhouse," Maggie replied simply. "I understand it remains unfinished and the town lacks a teacher. I believe I might help with both issues." Understanding dawned in the judge's eyes, followed by what might have been approval. "I see. Well, that is indeed council business. We'll look forward to hearing your thoughts." With a nod to both Maggie and Sam, he turned and entered the church. "The judge carries significant influence in town matters," Sam said quietly, once the older man was out of earshot. "Having his ear isn't a small thing." Maggie glanced at him, surprised. "You think he might support my proposal?" "The judge has 8 grandchildren between the ages of 6 and 12, Sam replied, with the ghost of a smile. "Education is a particular interest of his." Inside, the church had been arranged for the meeting, with rows of chairs facing a table where 5 men now sat. Judge Montgomery at the center, flanked by a younger man in an expensive suit, an older man in a shopkeeper's apron, a red-faced man with an impressive mustache, and a thin, bespectacled gentleman who appeared to be taking minutes in a large ledger. Sam guided Maggie to a seat near the back, where they joined approximately 20 other residents who had gathered for the meeting. Maggie noticed Harriet Miller among them, who acknowledged her with a slight nod and an encouraging smile. The council meeting progressed methodically through its agenda. Reports on road repairs, discussion of water rights for the coming summer, proposals for expanding the livery stable, and a heated debate about whether to enforce closing hours for the saloon. Maggie listened attentively, gaining insight into the town's concerns and dynamics. She noted how Judge Montgomery moderated discussions with a firm but fair hand, how the younger man in the suit, introduced as Howard Prescott, representing the mining company, spoke with practiced eloquence, and how the shopkeeper, Edward Jenkins, of the general store, seemed to consider each issue from a practical, financial perspective. Finally, as the main agenda items were concluded, Judge Montgomery cleared his throat. "We have time for any additional town business before we adjourn. I understand Miss Sullivan wishes to address the council." All eyes turned toward Maggie as she rose from her seat, notes clutched perhaps a bit too tightly in her hands. She made her way to the small open area before the council table, conscious of the curious gazes following her progress. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Gentlemen of the council, residents of Pine Ridge, thank you for allowing me to speak this evening. My name is Maggie Sullivan. I arrived in Pine Ridge only yesterday, but I've already seen evidence of a thriving community with ambitions for growth and prosperity." She paused, making eye contact with several council members before continuing. "I've also observed the unfinished schoolhouse on the edge of town, a testament to this community's recognition that education is essential for progress. I understand construction halted some months ago due to funding constraints. I'd like to propose a solution." Howard Prescott leaned forward slightly. "You're offering to fund the schoolhouse, Miss Sullivan?" His tone suggested skepticism. "No, Mr. Prescott," Maggie replied evenly. "I'm offering to teach in it. I was an educator for 15 years in Concord, Massachusetts, teaching children from primary levels through advanced studies. I have experience developing curriculum, managing classrooms of varied ages, and preparing students for further education or practical trades." She unfolded her notes, though she found she didn't need them after all. The words came naturally, powered by 15 years of passion for education and the desperate need to carve a place for herself in this new world. A community's investment in education pays dividends for generations. Children who can read, write, and calculate become adults who can manage businesses, improve agricultural techniques, and contribute to civic life. Pine Ridge is growing. I can see it in the new construction, in the families settling here. These children deserve more than scattered lessons at kitchen tables after the day's work is done. Edward Jenkins, the shopkeeper, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Sullivan?" "A partnership," Maggie replied. "I offer my services as the town's teacher, full-time, dedicated to building an educational foundation for Pine Ridge's children. In exchange, I ask the council to allocate funds to complete the schoolhouse construction and provide basic supplies. I've prepared estimates of what would be required." She stepped forward, placing her carefully prepared figures on the table. The red-faced man with the mustache, whom Maggie had learned was Franklin Weber, owner of the saloon, scoffed loudly. "And why would we entrust our children's education to a complete stranger? Someone who's been in town all of one day?" Maggie had anticipated this objection. "A fair question, Mr. Weber. I would, of course, provide references from the school board in Concord, attesting to my qualifications and character. I would also propose a trial period of 1 term, 3 months, during which the council can evaluate by teaching and determine if it meets the community's needs." Judge Montgomery was studying the figures Maggie had provided. "These estimates for completing the schoolhouse, they're quite detailed. How did you arrive at them?" "I took the liberty of examining the structure yesterday and this morning," Maggie explained. "I consulted with Miss Miller regarding local pricing for materials. The estimates include lumber for walls, roofing, windows, basic furnishings, and essential educational supplies." Howard Prescott exchanged glances with the judge. The mining company has expressed interest in contributing to community improvements. Education benefits us all, makes it easier to attract skilled workers with families. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. We might be able to contribute a portion of these costs. Edward Jenkins nodded slowly. Most families in town would be willing to pay a small monthly fee for proper schooling. Not enough to cover all expenses, but it would help sustain the school once established. Judge Montgomery looked directly at Maggie. And what of your personal situation, Miss Sullivan? Forgive my directness, but it's generally known you came to Pine Ridge to meet Thomas Blackwell, given that arrangement appears to have concluded. What assurance do we have that you intend to remain in Pine Ridge long term? The question struck at the heart of Maggie's vulnerability. Her uncertain position, her lack of connections, the fact that she had arrived with one purpose that had evaporated within hours. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the collective doubt about a woman who had been rejected once already. I came to Pine Ridge seeking a new beginning, Maggie said carefully, finding strength in the simple truth. The specific form of that beginning has changed, yes, but my desire to build something meaningful, to contribute to a community, to use the skills and knowledge I've spent years developing, that hasn't changed. I chose to stay in Pine Ridge despite having the means to leave because I saw potential here, in that unfinished schoolhouse, in the children I've observed playing in your streets, in the growth evident throughout your town. She squared her shoulders. I cannot predict the future, Judge Montgomery, but I can promise you this. If Pine Ridge welcomes me as its teacher, I will dedicate myself to providing the finest education possible for its children. I will be a credit to this community, and I will consider it my home for as long as you'll have me. A silence followed her words, broken only by the soft creaking of the church's wooden floors. Then from the back of the room, a voice spoke. I'll vouch for her. Heads turned as Sam Wilson rose to his feet. Maggie stared at him in surprise. Wilson? Judge Montgomery prompted. I'll vouch for Miss Sullivan's character, Sam said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. And I'll contribute lumber from my property for the schoolhouse roof and flooring. Murmurs rippled through the gathered residents. Sam Wilson was not known for involving himself in town affairs beyond necessity, and certainly not for making public declarations or financial commitments. That's generous of you, Wilson, Howard Prescott said, a note of curiosity in his voice. May I ask why? Sam's gaze briefly met Maggie's before returning to the council. Education matters. Miss Sullivan is qualified. The town needs a school. He shrugged as if the logic was self-evident. Seems like an opportunity we'd be fools to waste. Franklin Weber snorted. Just because she's pretty doesn't mean... Miss Sullivan was examining that schoolhouse foundation before sunrise this morning. Harriet Miller interrupted, standing as well. Making notes, taking measurements, planning, not standing around waiting for someone to solve her problems. She looked pointedly at Weber. I'll contribute curtains for the windows and help organize the mothers to provide what else is needed. Suddenly, others were speaking up. Edward Jenkins offering discounted supplies from his store, a rancher's wife volunteering to help with painting, a carpenter proposing to bring his apprentices to work on the building as practice. The momentum shifted palpably in the room, and Maggie watched in astonishment as her fragile hope transformed into a community project before her eyes. Judge Montgomery eventually raised his hands for quiet. It seems Miss Sullivan's proposal has struck a chord. He looked at his fellow council members. Shall we put it to a vote, gentlemen? The vote was not unanimous. Franklin Weber remained opposed, but it was decisive. The Pine Ridge Town Council would allocate funds to complete the schoolhouse, supplemented by the private contributions offered during the meeting. Maggie Sullivan would be employed as the town's teacher for an initial term of 3 months, after which a permanent arrangement would be considered based on the community's satisfaction with her work. As the meeting adjourned, residents gathered around Maggie, introducing themselves, mentioning children or grandchildren who would attend the school, offering assistance with the building completion. Harriet squeezed her arm in congratulation before being pulled into a conversation about coordinating the women's contributions to the schoolhouse furnishings. It wasn't until the crowd began to disperse that Maggie found a moment to approach Sam Wilson, who was speaking quietly with Judge Montgomery near the church entrance. "Mr. Wilson," she said, as the judge excused himself with a nod. "I don't know how to thank you. Your support was unexpected." Sam studied her face in that careful way of his. "No need for thanks. Meant what I said. Town needs a school. You're qualified to teach. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple, and they both knew it. He had put his reputation behind a woman he barely knew, had committed valuable resources from his ranch, had shifted the entire tone of the meeting with a few well-chosen words. "Nevertheless," Maggie said softly, "I am grateful for the lumber, for your confidence, for—" She hesitated. "For seeing possibility where others saw only limitations." Something flickered in Sam's eyes, a warmth that seemed to soften the weathered lines of his face. "Sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see what's been in front of us all along." He cleared his throat, gesturing toward the darkening street outside. "It's getting late. May I walk you back to the boarding house, Miss Sullivan?" "Please," she replied with a small smile, "and I think under the circumstances you might call me Maggie." They walked through the quiet streets of Pine Ridge, the sunset painting the western mountains in shades of gold and purple. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sense of possibilities that hadn't existed just hours before. At the boarding house steps, Sam paused. "Construction on the schoolhouse can begin as early as next week. I'll have the lumber delivered once Jenkins organizes the building crew." "I'll be ready," Maggie assured him. "I should start planning the curriculum, making lists of necessary books and supplies." A rare smile touched Sam's lips. "One step at a time, Miss Maggie. You've accomplished plenty for one day." She nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. But it was the good exhaustion that comes from purpose and progress, not the hollow fatigue of despair she'd felt the previous evening. "Good night, Sam," she said, testing the informality of his first name. "Good night, Maggie," he replied, the words carrying a weight of significance that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "Welcome to Pine Ridge." As he turned to leave, Maggie called after him softly, "Sam, why did you really speak up for me tonight?" He paused, considering her question with the same care he seemed to give all things. "Because yesterday by the creek, when you thought no one was watching, you didn't weep like someone beaten. You wept like someone gathering strength." He tipped his hat. "Good teachers know the difference." Then he was gone, moving down the darkened street with his unhurried gait, leaving Maggie to wonder how this quiet, silver-haired rancher had seen so clearly what she herself had only begun to understand, that endings and beginnings were often the same thing, viewed from different sides of a moment. Dawn painted the eastern sky with strokes of pink and gold as Maggie made her way to the unfinished schoolhouse. The morning air still carried the chill of night, her breath visible in small clouds that dissipated in the growing light. She had woken early, too excited by the previous night's developments to sleep late, and had decided to visit the structure that would soon become the center of her new life in Pine Ridge. The schoolhouse foundation stood solid, the partial framing reaching toward the sky like a promise, waiting to be fulfilled. Maggie circled it slowly, mentally placing walls, windows, a proper door. She envisioned children seated at desks, their faces turned toward her with curiosity and trust. The thought sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the rising sun. "You're an early riser." Maggie turned to find Edward Jenkins approaching, a leather-bound ledger tucked under one arm. The general store owner's silver-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes simple but well-maintained. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," she greeted him with a smile. "I wanted to see the schoolhouse again in the daylight." Jenkins nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Wanted to be sure last night wasn't just a dream, I expect." He joined her in surveying the structure. "First saw this place go up 6 months ago. Town had good intentions, but intentions don't put a roof overhead." "It will now," Maggie said, with quiet confidence. "Indeed it will." Jenkins opened his ledger, revealing pages of neat columns and figures. "I've been working on supply lists and costs. With the funds allocated by the council and the contributions offered, we should be able to complete the basic structure and furnishing within 3 weeks, weather permitting." Maggie's eyes widened. "So quickly," Jenkins chuckled. "That's one thing about Pine Ridge, Miss Sullivan. When this town finally decides to do something, it doesn't waste time about it. We've waited too long for a proper school as it is." They spent the next hour discussing specifics, lumber dimensions, window placements, the positioning of the teacher's desk and student seating. Jenkins made notes in his precise handwriting, adding to what was clearly a well-organized project. Plan. "The building crew will start tomorrow," he informed her as they concluded. "Carter's bringing his carpentry apprentices. Wilson's lumber should arrive by noon, and I've got boys ready to help with the hauling." "I'd like to help as well," Maggie said, her voice firm despite Jenkins' raised eyebrows. "I may not know much about construction, but I can certainly assist with smaller tasks." The shopkeeper studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I suspect you're not a woman who's content to sit idle while others work, Miss Sullivan." "Very well. The men might find it unusual at first, but they'll adjust." His eyes crinkled with amusement. "Just don't be surprised if Martha from the cafe starts bringing extra portions when she delivers lunch to the workers." As they walked back toward town, the streets were coming to life. Shopkeepers swept their porches, ranch hands rode through on their way to the day's work, and women carried baskets to and from the mercantile, many pausing to nod or stare curiously at Maggie. News of the council's decision had clearly spread overnight. At the corner where they would part ways, Jenkins hesitated. "Miss Sullivan, if I may. Pine Ridge isn't always quick to embrace change or newcomers. Last night was unusual in many ways." He cleared his throat. "Sam Wilson's support carries significant weight here. He's not a man who speaks often at such gatherings, but when he does, people listen." Maggie had been pondering the same thing since the meeting. "May I ask why? Mr. Wilson seems private, not the type to involve himself in town politics." "Sam keeps to himself, that's true enough. But he was one of the first to settle here, back when Pine Ridge was hardly more than a water stop and a few tents. Built that ranch with his own hands, alongside his Sarah." Jenkins' expression softened at the name. She was something special, Sarah Wilson. Taught reading and figures to half the children in the area before the fever took her 12 years ago. Understanding dawned. "He lost his wife," Maggie said softly. Jenkins nodded. "And their unborn child hit him hard, withdrew into his work, his land. Still helps neighbors when needed, still trades fairly with the town, but keeps his distance otherwise." He looked at Maggie with newfound curiosity. "Which is why folks took notice when he spoke up for you last night. Sam Wilson doesn't bestow his confidence lightly." The revelation settled over Maggie like a weight, not unpleasant, but significant. Sam's support wasn't merely a kindness to a stranger, it was a departure from more than a decade of careful distance. She wasn't certain what to make of that. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. Jenkins tipped his hat. "See you tomorrow at the construction site, Miss Sullivan." The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the schoolhouse foundation. Wagons arrived loaded with lumber, tools clanged against wood and stone, and voices called instructions across the site. Maggie arrived wearing her plainest dress, hair tied back beneath a simple bonnet, determined to be useful rather than merely decorative. The men's reactions varied from confusion to amusement to quiet respect as she rolled up her sleeves and asked how she might help. Under the guidance of Joseph Carter, the town's senior carpenter, Maggie spent the morning holding boards steady for cutting, carrying smaller pieces of lumber where needed, and fetching tools for the workers. Her hands, more accustomed to chalk and books than hammers and saws, were soon smudged with dirt and developing blisters, but she worked steadily, ignoring the occasional aches. By midday, the framework for 2 walls had been erected, the outline of the schoolhouse taking more definite shape against the sky. Martha from the cafe arrived with baskets of food, stew, bread, and apple tarts, still warm from the oven. As Jenkins had predicted, she brought an extra portion when she spotted Maggie among the workers. "Never seen a lady helping with building before," Martha commented, handing Maggie a cloth-wrapped package containing a generous serving of stew and a thick slice of bread. "Though I suppose a teacher's not quite like other ladies, is she?" Maggie accepted the food with thanks, too hungry to be offended by Martha's assessment. She found a relatively clean spot on a pile of lumber and sat to eat, observing the easy camaraderie of the men as they joked and discussed the afternoon's work plans. Despite the physical labor, she felt a deep satisfaction in watching the school take shape, knowing her own hands had contributed, however modestly, to its creation. She was just finishing her meal when a wagon laden with more lumber rumbled onto the site. Sam Wilson handled the reins, his expression focused as he guided the team to where the wood was being stacked. He spoke briefly with Carter, then began unloading the boards with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to physical work. Maggie hesitated, then gathered her courage and approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson," she said, falling back on formality despite their agreement to use first names. Sam paused, wiping his brow with a bandana before turning to her. His eyes widened slightly at her appearance, the practical dress now smudged with dirt, the loose strands of hair escaping her bonnet, the reddened hands that spoke of unaccustomed labor. "Maggie," he acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you working alongside the crew." "I wanted to help," she explained simply. "It seems right to participate in building the school, not just teach in it afterward." Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Lumber's better quality than I expected," he said, changing the subject. "Cut from the north side of my property last fall. Been seasoning well." Maggie ran her hand along one of the boards, feeling the smooth grain beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful wood. The school will be sturdy." "That's the idea." Sam lifted another board from the wagon. "Building needs to last, same as the learning that happens inside it." They worked side by side for a time, Maggie helping to stack the smaller pieces while Sam handled the heavier boards. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable, punctuated by the sounds of construction around them and the occasional instruction from Carter to his apprentices. As the afternoon progressed, more town residents stopped by to observe the progress or offer assistance. Harriet Miller arrived with several other women, carrying measuring strings and fabric samples for the future curtains. They conferred with Maggie about window placements and light considerations, treating her with a respect that warmed her more than she'd expected. To Maggie's surprise, Judge Montgomery also made an appearance, leaning on his walking stick as he surveyed the growing structure with evident approval. "You've made remarkable progress for one day," he commented. "I'm pleased to see the community coming together on this project." "It's been extraordinary," Maggie agreed, conscious of her disheveled appearance, but too grateful for the judge's continued support to feel truly self-conscious. Everyone has been so generous with their time and resources. The judge's keen eyes moved from Maggie to Sam, who was conferring with Carter about roof beams nearby. "Indeed," he murmured, "quite extraordinary." By sunset, the basic frame of the schoolhouse stood complete. 4 walls defined, window and door openings marked, the outline of what would become the roof beginning to take shape. As the workers dispersed, promising to return the following morning, Maggie stood before the structure, a profound sense of accomplishment washing over her despite her physical exhaustion. "It's really happening," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Did you doubt it would?" Sam asked, appearing beside her, his own day's work evident in the sawdust clinging to his clothes and the healthy tiredness in his posture. Maggie considered the question seriously. Perhaps not the building itself, not after last night's meeting, but the welcome, the willingness to include me so quickly, that I didn't expect. Sam nodded thoughtfully. Pine Ridge isn't perfect, has its share of gossips and grudge holders. But when something matters, really matters, folks here know how to come together. "And a school matters," Maggie said. "Understanding." "To most," Sam agreed. "To those with vision enough to see beyond today." He glanced at her hands, noting the developing blisters with a small frown. "You should soak those in cool water tonight. Add a spoonful of salt if you have it." Maggie looked down at her reddened palms with rueful acknowledgement. "I'm afraid I'm more accustomed to chalk dust than hammer calluses." "Yet you worked all day without complaint," Sam observed. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small tin. "Salve," he explained, offering it to her. "Made from beeswax and herbs, helps with the soreness." Maggie accepted the tin, touched by the practical kindness. "Thank you." As the sunset deepened around them, casting long shadows across the schoolhouse frame, neither seemed eager to leave. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. "I should get the wagon back to the ranch. More lumber coming tomorrow. And I should prepare for tomorrow's work as well," Maggie agreed, though in truth she wasn't certain her muscles would allow much more physical labor. She would need to focus on planning for the actual school soon. Curriculum, schedules, needed supplies. Sam seemed to read her thoughts. "You've done your share with the building. No one would think less of you for turning to your teaching preparations now." Maggie smiled, grateful for his understanding. "Perhaps you're right, though I'd like to continue helping when I can." "Stubborn," Sam commented, but the word held no criticism, only a quiet sort of admiration. "Good night, Maggie." "Good night, Sam." She watched him drive the wagon away, his straight-backed silhouette gradually disappearing into the gathering darkness. Only then did Maggie realize she was still holding the tin of salve, its metal surface warm from her grip. Somehow, the simple gift felt more personal than any flowery compliment Thomas Blackwell had written in his letters. The following week passed in a blur of activity. The schoolhouse rose steadily under the skilled hands of Carter and his crew, while Maggie divided her time between helping with smaller construction tasks and beginning her educational preparations. Word of the school spread through the surrounding countryside, and families with children began to visit, introducing themselves and inquiring about enrollment. Maggie kept a careful list of potential students, noting ages, previous education, and particular interests or challenges. By the end of the week, she had 27 children registered, ranging from 6-year-old twins who had never held a pencil to a serious 15-year-old boy whose father wanted him to improve his mathematics before taking over their family's ranch. The diversity of needs was daunting but familiar. In Concord, Maggie had often taught multiple grade levels simultaneously, developing systems to engage all students while providing individualized attention where needed. Here, the challenge would be compounded by limited resources and varied backgrounds, but the fundamentals remained the same: connect with each child, build on existing knowledge, and foster a genuine love of learning. On the 10th day of construction, as the roof was being completed and the interior work beginning, Thomas Blackwell made an unexpected appearance at the site. Maggie was inside, discussing the placement of shelves with Carter, when a sudden hush from the workers alerted her to something unusual. She emerged into the sunlight to find Thomas standing awkwardly at the edge of the cleared area, his hat in his hands. Their eyes met across the distance, and Maggie felt a curious detachment, as though the devastating rejection he'd delivered was something that had happened to someone else or in another lifetime. She approached him with polite composure, aware of the watchful eyes of the construction crew. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him neutrally. Thomas cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Miss Sullivan, I was riding past and saw the progress on the schoolhouse. Heard in town you're to be the teacher." "That's correct," Maggie confirmed, waiting. He shifted his weight, glancing at the nearly completed building. "It's coming along well. Town's needed a school for some time." "Yes." Thomas seemed to be struggling to find his next words. Finally, he said, "I have a niece and nephew at my sister's homestead about 3 miles east. They'd benefit from schooling. Would they be welcome to attend?" The request surprised Maggie. She hadn't expected Thomas to seek her services after, rejecting her so thoroughly as a potential wife. But the children weren't responsible for their uncle's actions, and she had no intention of allowing personal feelings to interfere with her professional responsibilities. "All children are welcome," she said firmly. "Please have your sister come see me to register them when convenient. We expect to open in 2 weeks' time." Relief crossed Thomas's face, followed by something that might have been regret. "I'm glad you found a place here, Miss Sullivan. It seems to suit you." Before Maggie could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Blackwell." Sam Wilson stood a few yards away, additional roof shingles in his arms, his expression unreadable. "Something you needed?" Thomas straightened, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his features. "Just inquiring about the school for my sister's children, Wilson. Nothing that concerns you." Sam's gaze remained steady. "Miss Sullivan has work to do, as do the rest of us." The dismissal was clear. Thomas nodded stiffly to Maggie, replaced his hat, and departed without further comment. As the normal sounds of construction resumed around them, Maggie turned to Sam with a mixture of gratitude and mild exasperation. "That wasn't necessary," she said quietly. "I can manage my own conversations." Sam set down the shingles carefully. "Never doubted it," he replied, his tone neutral. "But Blackwell has a way of taking more than his share of time and attention." There was something in his voice, a protectiveness perhaps, that made Maggie study him more closely. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, "but I assure you, Mr. Blackwell no longer has any power to upset me." Sam met her gaze directly. "Good," he said simply, and returned to his work. The encounter left Maggie thoughtful for the remainder of the day. She had spoken truly. Thomas's appearance had stirred no particular emotion beyond mild surprise. In the short time since his rejection, her life had taken a direction she could never have anticipated, one that already felt more authentic to her true self than the role of rancher's wife ever could have been. As the second week of construction neared its end, the schoolhouse transformation was remarkable. Walls stood solid, windows gleamed with new glass, and the roof provided shelter from both sun and the occasional spring shower. Inside, built-in bookshelves lined one wall, while sturdy desks crafted by Carter and his apprentices were arranged in neat rows. A larger desk for Maggie stood at the front, accompanied by a blackboard mounted on the wall behind it. The only element still lacking was books. The town council had allocated funds for basic primers and slates, but a proper school library remained beyond their current budget. Maggie had brought a few volumes from her personal collection, but they were woefully inadequate for the range of ages and abilities she would be teaching. On the evening before the school's scheduled opening ceremony, Maggie sat alone in the completed building, making final preparations for her first day of teaching. The fading sunlight streamed through the western windows, casting long golden rectangles across the wooden floor. She had arranged and rearranged the desks, written welcome messages on the blackboard, and prepared individual slates for each registered student. Now she sat at her teacher's desk, a profound mix of excitement and anxiety churning within her. A knock at the open door broke her reverie. Sam Wilson stood in the entrance, a wooden crate in his arms. "Thought you might still be here," he said, stepping inside. Maggie rose to greet him. "Just finishing the preparations. Tomorrow's the big day." Sam nodded, setting the crate on her desk with careful movements. "Brought something for the school," he said, stepping back as though suddenly self-conscious. Curious, Maggie moved forward and lifted the cloth covering the crate's contents. Inside were books, at least 24 volumes of varying sizes and conditions. She lifted one gently, opening it to find a collection of poetry by Longfellow. Another revealed itself to be a comprehensive atlas of the United States, while a third contained detailed illustrations of plant and animal species. "Sam," she breathed, overcome with emotion as she surveyed the unexpected treasure. "Where did these come from?" He shifted slightly, his weathered hand moving to touch one of the books with a gentleness that belied their calloused strength. "Sarah's books," he said quietly. "My wife's. She collected them over the years, ordered some from catalogs, received others as gifts. They've been in trunks at the ranch since." He didn't finish the sentence. The significance of the gesture struck Maggie profoundly. These weren't simply books, they were memories, connections to a woman he had loved and lost, treasures he had kept private for more than a decade. "I can't possibly accept these," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're too precious." Sam's eyes met hers, clear and certain. Books aren't meant to sit in trunks gathering dust. Sarah would have wanted them used, wanted children learning from them. He paused, something vulnerable flickering in his expression. "Seems right. They should come here to you." Maggie touched the books with reverent fingers, understanding the true gift wasn't just the volumes themselves, but the trust Sam was placing in her. "I'll ensure they're treated with care," she promised, "and that the children know how special they are." "There's a register in the bottom," Sam added, reaching down to extract a leather-bound notebook. "Sarah kept track of what she read, made notes sometimes. Thought you might find it useful." Maggie opened the notebook to find page after page of neat, flowing handwriting, observations on different books, teaching notes, ideas for lessons. It was as though Sarah Wilson had reached across time to offer guidance to another teacher, faced with similar challenges. "This is..." Words failed her. "Thank you doesn't seem adequate." No need for thanks," Sam replied, his characteristic response to gratitude, though his eyes revealed more than his words. "Just thought they belonged here." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the golden light of sunset gradually fading around them. Finally, Sam cleared his throat. "Should let you finish your preparations. Big day tomorrow." Maggie nodded, still overwhelmed by his gift. "Will you be at the opening ceremony?" Sam hesitated. "Not one for public gatherings much," he admitted. "But I'll stop by, see how the books are settling in." As he turned to leave, Maggie impulsively reached out, briefly touching his arm. "Sam, wait." When he paused, she continued, "Would you consider, that is, I wondered if you might be willing to speak to the students occasionally, about ranching, about the early days of Pine Ridge. First-hand knowledge is invaluable in education. He seemed genuinely surprised by the request. Not much of a talker, as you might have noticed. But you have experiences worth sharing. Maggie persisted gently. Things these children should know about the place they call home, the land they'll inherit. Sam considered this, his expression thoughtful. Could show them things, perhaps. Better than just talking. How to read weather signs, identify tracks, know which plants are useful. Maggie smiled, recognizing his offer for the gift it was. Another opening of his private world. They would benefit enormously from such knowledge. Then I'll consider it, he agreed with a small nod. Good night, Maggie. Good night, Sam, and thank you for everything. After he left, Maggie sat among the books he had brought, running her fingers over their spines and thinking about the woman who had collected them, Sarah Wilson, who had taught the children of Pine Ridge before her, who had loved books and learning and, clearly, had been deeply loved by the quiet, silver-haired rancher who now found himself reaching out to a new teacher from the East. She opened Sarah's notebook again, reading entries at random, finding a kindred spirit in the thoughtful observations and clever teaching ideas. One entry caught her eye, a quote copied from Emerson. "The things taught in schools are not an education, but the means of education." Beneath it, Sarah had written, "Remember this always. We give them tools, not answers. We open doors, but they must walk through themselves." Maggie touched the words gently, a connection forming across years and circumstances. Two women separated by time but united by purpose. Perhaps this was why Sam had brought the books tonight, why he had entrusted her with these precious remnants, not just for the students, but for her, a gift of understanding from someone who had walked this path before. Tomorrow, the schoolhouse would fill with children's voices, marking the official beginning of Maggie's new life in Pine Ridge. But tonight, in the quiet of the empty classroom with Sarah's books and words surrounding her, she felt that life had already begun in ways she could never have imagined when she first stepped off the stagecoach just 3 weeks ago. The woman who had traveled west seeking a husband had found something perhaps more precious: purpose, community, and the beginnings of what might be a deeper connection than any she had dared to hope for. Not the future she had planned, but one that increasingly felt like the future she was meant to have all along. The morning of the school's opening dawned clear and bright, with just enough crispness in the air to hint at the approaching autumn. Maggie had been awake since before, first light, unable to sleep through her anticipation. She dressed with special care in her best navy dress, with its crisp white collar, pinned her hair into a neat arrangement that she hoped conveyed both professionalism and approachability, and carefully packed her teaching materials into the leather satchel that had accompanied her from Concord. Mrs. Fletcher had prepared a special breakfast for the occasion: eggs, bacon, and hotcakes with maple syrup that she'd been saving for a significant event. "Can't have our teacher starting her first day on an empty stomach," she declared, watching with satisfaction as Maggie ate. In the 3 weeks since her arrival in Pine Ridge, the boarding house proprietress had transformed from suspicious observer to staunch supporter, proudly telling anyone who would listen that she was housing the town's first proper educator. Maggie arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before the scheduled opening ceremony, wanting time to make final preparations in solitude. The building stood proudly in the morning light, its fresh lumber still aromatic, windows gleaming. Inside, she lit the lamps even though sunlight streamed through the windows, creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. She arranged Sam's books prominently on the shelves, opened Sarah's teaching journal on her desk for inspiration, and wrote a welcome message on the blackboard in her best penmanship. At 8:30, the first families began to arrive. Children, in their best clothes, approached with varying expressions of excitement, nervousness, or reluctance. Parents introduced themselves, offering words of support or making specific requests regarding their children's education needs. Maggie greeted each family warmly, making mental notes of details that might help her connect with individual students. By 9 o'clock, a small crowd had gathered in front of the schoolhouse. Judge Montgomery stood at the center, supported by his walking stick, his expression one of dignified satisfaction. The town council members flanked him, along with Edward Jenkins, Joseph Carter, and other prominent citizens who had contributed to the project. Harriet Miller moved through the crowd, making last-minute adjustments to children's attire and engaging in her characteristic straightforward conversations with parents. Maggie scanned the gathering, feeling a twinge of disappointment at not seeing a certain silver-haired rancher among them. But Sam had warned her he wasn't one for public events, and she reminded herself that he'd promised to visit later. Still, she had hoped. Judge Montgomery cleared his throat, bringing the crowd to attention. "Citizens of Pine Ridge," he began, his judicial voice carrying clearly across the schoolyard. "Today marks a significant milestone in our community's development. With the completion of this schoolhouse and the appointment of Miss Sullivan as our teacher, we take an important step towards securing Pine Ridge's future." The speech that followed touched on the importance of education, the community effort that had made the school possible, and the expectations for how it would benefit the town. Finally, Judge Montgomery turned to Maggie with a formal nod. "Miss Sullivan, the town of Pine Ridge entrusts its children to your care and instruction. May you guide them with wisdom, patience, and dedication." Maggie stepped forward, heart pounding but voice steady. "I accept this responsibility with gratitude and commitment," she replied. "Education is not merely about facts and figures, but about nurturing minds, hearts, and character. I promise to give my best to each child who enters this schoolhouse." With that, Judge Montgomery handed Maggie a large iron key, more symbolic than functional, as the schoolhouse door had a simple latch, which she accepted with appropriate solemnity. Applause rippled through the crowd as Maggie unlocked the door and formally invited the students to enter their new school for the first time. 27 children filed into the classroom, ranging from the tiny Wheeler twins, who clung to each other's hands, to lanky James Peterson, who had to duck his head slightly to pass through the doorway. They found seats at the desks, eyes wide, as they took in the new environment. Parents crowded the doorway, peering in with expressions ranging from pride to anxiety. Maggie gave them a reassuring smile. "The children will be dismissed at 3 o'clock, she announced. "You're welcome to return then." As the adults reluctantly dispersed, Maggie turned to her students, feeling a familiar calm settle over her. This, the classroom, the expectant faces, the potential waiting to be nurtured, this was where she belonged. "Good morning," she began warmly. "I'm Miss Sullivan, and I'm honored to be your teacher." The first day passed in a whirl of introductions, assessments, and establishing routines. Maggie grouped the children roughly by age and ability, devising a rotational system where one group would work independently while she instructed another directly. By lunchtime, she had identified her most advanced students, those who would need extra support, and several who showed particular aptitude in specific subjects. The children ate their packed lunches in the schoolyard, gradually relaxing from their initial formality as they played and chattered. Maggie supervised from the doorway, making mental notes about social dynamics and individual personalities that would help her create an effective learning environment. The afternoon session focused on reading assessments, with Maggie listening. To each child read a passage appropriate to their presumed level. Some stumbled over simple words, others read fluently but without comprehension, and a few demonstrated remarkable literacy. She recorded each child's performance in her teaching journal, already planning tailored approaches for different needs. When 3 o'clock arrived, parents gathered outside once more. Maggie dismissed the children with a brief preview of the next day's activities, then stood in the doorway as they reunited with their families, many already excitedly relating their first day experiences. As the schoolyard gradually emptied, Maggie noticed a wagon approaching from the north road. Her heart lifted as she recognized the driver, Sam Wilson, true to his word, coming to see how his books were settling in. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the clearing, watching the departing families with a thoughtful expression before climbing down and approaching the schoolhouse. "How did they do?" he asked by way of greeting, nodding toward the last of the departing children. "Better than I expected," Maggie replied honestly. "There's a wide range of abilities, but they're eager to learn." All 27 attended. Sam nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes, including Blackwell's niece and nephew. "Yes, Elizabeth and Joshua Crawford. Bright children, though Joshua is somewhat reluctant. Their mother seems very committed to their education." They moved inside, where the evidence of the day's activities was apparent in the chalk marks on the board, papers on desks, and the slightly altered arrangement of furniture to accommodate the children's varying sizes. The books were a tremendous hit, Maggie told him, gesturing to the shelves where several volumes had been moved as students explored them during their free time. Especially the atlas and the illustrated natural history. I've already planned lessons around them for later this week. Sam ran his fingers lightly over the spines of the books, a complicated emotion crossing his weathered features. "Good," he said simply. "Sarah would have liked that." Maggie watched him, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "I found her teaching notes invaluable," she offered. "Her approach to handling different age groups in one classroom is similar to what I developed in Concord, but she had several innovations I hadn't considered." Sam looked up, something warming in his expression. She was always finding better ways to do things, never satisfied with good enough. He paused, seeming to debate with himself before continuing. "She talked about building a proper school, almost from the day we settled here. Said a community wasn't really established until it educated its own." "She was right," Maggie said softly. "Yes," Sam agreed. "She usually was." He fell silent, gaze drifting to the window where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard. Maggie busied herself straightening the students' desks, allowing him space for his memories. Finally, he turned back to her. "I brought something else," he said, gesturing toward his wagon outside, "if you're interested." Curious, Maggie followed him out to the wagon, where he pulled back a tarp to reveal a small wooden cabinet, carefully constructed with dovetail joints and a polished finish. "The school needs a proper place for supplies," Sam explained, lifting the cabinet with practiced ease. "Slates, papers, pencils and such. Thought this might help." "You made this?" Maggie asked, admiring the craftsmanship as he carried it. "Into the schoolhouse. Winter evenings are long on the ranch," he replied, with a hint of self-consciousness. "Woodworking passes the time." They positioned the cabinet near Maggie's desk, its dimensions perfect for the space. When opened, it revealed multiple compartments and drawers of various sizes, ideal for organizing the school's limited but growing collection of supplies. "It's beautiful, Sam," Maggie said sincerely, "and exactly what we needed. How did you know?" A rare smile touched his lips. Remembered Sarah storing her teaching materials in baskets and crates. Always said she needed proper drawers to keep things sorted. He shrugged. "Figured some things about teaching don't change much." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Maggie deeply. "Thank you. The children will be delighted to have a special place for their school materials." Sam nodded, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's practical, is all." But they both knew it was more than that. Like the books, The cabinet represented something beyond its physical utility, a connection between past and present, a way of honoring what had been while supporting what was becoming. As autumn settled over Pine Ridge, the school quickly became the center of Maggie's life and an increasingly important part of the community. Her days fell into a pleasant rhythm, teaching during daylight hours, preparing lessons in the evenings, and gradually expanding the school's resources with donations from townspeople and materials ordered through Edward Jenkins's store. Children progressed at varying rates, but all showed improvement. The Wheeler twins learned to form their letters with painstaking concentration. James Peterson discovered an aptitude for mathematics that surprised even himself. Elizabeth Crawford revealed a talent for storytelling that held the younger children spellbound during lunch breaks. Maggie's relationship with the town also evolved. Her initial status as a curiosity, the rejected mail-order bride who stayed, gave way to respect for her educational abilities and dedication. She was invited to Sunday dinners, consulted on community matters related to children, and gradually accepted as a permanent part of Pine Ridge rather than a temporary visitor. Her friendship with Harriet Miller deepened into a genuine bond, the dressmaker's forthright manner and practical wisdom providing both guidance and companionship. Judge Montgomery became something of a patron, donating books from his personal library and occasionally visiting the school to tell the children stories of Pine Ridge's early days. And then there was Sam. The silver-haired rancher never became a frequent visitor to town, maintaining his characteristic privacy. But he developed a pattern of stopping by the schoolhouse every Friday afternoon, ostensibly to check if anything needed repair or to drop off items he thought might be useful. A set of carved wooden numbers for the younger children, specimens of local plants pressed between glass for science lessons, a handcrafted stand for the atlas to protect its binding. Each visit was brief, their conversations largely focused on practical matters, yet Maggie found herself looking forward to these encounters with an anticipation that both thrilled and unsettled her. There was something in Sam's steady gaze and quiet attentiveness that spoke to her more eloquently than any flowery declarations. 6 weeks after the school's opening, as the first frost silvered the grass and trees displayed their autumn finery, Sam arrived on his regular Friday visit. With an unusual request, thought the children might benefit from seeing how a working ranch operates, he said, standing before Maggie's desk as the last students departed for the day. If you're agreeable, they could visit Wilson Ranch next week, see the cattle, learn about what goes into raising them, maybe watch the hands work with the horses. Maggie looked up from her lesson plans in surprise. Having maintained his privacy for so long, this invitation to bring 27 children to his personal domain seemed a significant departure. That would be wonderful, she said warmly. A first-hand lesson in local economy and agriculture would be invaluable. But are you certain 27 children can be, energetic? A hint of a smile crossed Sam's face. Figured as much. Got 3 hands who've agreed to help show them around. Thought we could divide them into groups, rotate through different areas of the ranch. Maggie was touched by the evidence that he'd given the visit serious thought. You've planned this carefully. Sam shrugged, though a faint color appeared high on his weathered cheeks. Just practical. Children learn better by seeing and doing than just hearing about things. Yes, they do, Maggie agreed, remembering similar sentiments in Sarah's teaching. Journal, we would be delighted to accept your invitation when would be most convenient. They settled on the following Wednesday, with Sam offering to send wagons to transport the children safely to and from the ranch. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. There's a patch of late wildflowers on the North Ridge, he said, the apparent non sequitur surprising Maggie. Thought the children might enjoy seeing them before the first hard freeze takes them. Could make a nature study of it. Maggie smiled, understanding the underlying consideration in his seemingly casual suggestion. I'm sure they would love that. Thank you, Sam. He nodded, touching the brim of his hat in that characteristic gesture, and departed. Maggie remained at her desk long after he'd gone, reflecting on how this quiet, silver-haired rancher had become such an unexpected but significant presence in her new life. The field trip to Wilson Ranch proved to be one of the most successful educational experiences Maggie had ever orchestrated. The children were beside themselves with excitement as they loaded into the wagons Sam had sent, their usual classroom decorum temporarily abandoned in favor of animated chatter about what they might see. Wilson Ranch revealed itself to be larger and more prosperous than Maggie had imagined. The main house was a substantial log structure with additions built as the ranch had grown, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Several ranch hands worked around the property, pausing to watch with amused interest as the children tumbled from the wagons. Sam greeted them at the main yard, his usual reserved manner somewhat softened as he welcomed the students to his home. He had clearly prepared for their visit. 3 of his most personable ranch hands were ready to guide groups. Areas had been set up to demonstrate different aspects of ranch life, and even the livestock seemed to have been selected for their docile temperaments. The day unfolded as a wonderful adventure for the children and an illuminating experience for Maggie. They observed cattle being worked in the corrals, learned about the care and training of horses, examined tools and equipment used in daily ranch operations, and even had the opportunity to assist with simple, safe tasks like gathering eggs and feeding chickens. Sam himself led a group to the promised Wildflower Ridge, where he surprised Maggie with his extensive knowledge of local flora. He knew not only the common names of plants, but their scientific classifications, medicinal properties, and roles in the ecosystem. The children listened with rapt attention as he explained how certain flowers attracted specific pollinators, his quiet voice animated with genuine passion for the natural world. You've studied botany formally, Maggie observed as they walked, slightly behind the children on the return path. Sam glanced at her, then back to the mountains beyond. Sarah's interest originally, he admitted. She ordered books, collected specimens. After she was gone, I found myself continuing, gives meaning to the changing seasons, watching what blooms and when. The simple statement revealed more about his grief and healing than any lengthy explanation could have. Maggie nodded, understanding how knowledge could become a bridge to someone lost, a way of maintaining connection across the divide of absence. Midday brought everyone together for a picnic lunch under the cottonwood trees near the house. The ranch cook had prepared a feast of sandwiches, fried chicken, potato salad, and apple pie that had the children wide-eyed with appreciation. As they ate, Sam's ranch hands shared stories of life on the frontier, carefully edited for young ears, but full of the authentic details that made history come alive. Maggie watched Sam throughout the meal, noting how he moved among the children with a gentle attentiveness that belied his usual reserve. He answered questions patiently, demonstrated how to properly hold a lariat when young Joshua Crawford asked, and ensured that the shy Wheeler twins were included in conversations. There was a natural ease to his interactions with the children that Maggie hadn't anticipated, a warmth that emerged in this setting where he was most comfortable. As the afternoon drew to a close and the children began loading back into the wagons, tired but exhilarated from their day of practical learning, Sam approached Maggie with an unexpected invitation. "Thought you might want to see the house," he said quietly, nodding toward the main ranch building. "If you have time before heading back to town." Maggie hesitated, aware of the personal nature of the invitation. In the months of their acquaintance, Sam had never suggested she visit his home. The schoolhouse, the town, these were neutral territories. His ranch house was private, intimate in a way that carried implications. "I'd like that," she replied simply. She arranged for Harriet, who had accompanied them as an additional chaperone, to return to town with the children, promising to follow later. If Harriet suspected anything significant about the arrangement, she kept her thoughts to herself, merely nodding with her characteristic directness. The ranch house revealed itself to be a testament to years of careful building and expansion. The original cabin structure formed what was now the central living area, with a stone fireplace and hand-hewn beams overhead. Wings had been added as the ranch prospered. A proper kitchen, additional bedrooms, a study lined with bookshelves that immediately drew Maggie's eye. "This was Sarah's favorite room," Sam said, following her gaze to the study. She called it her thinking room, spent hours reading, writing in her journals. Maggie approached the bookshelves reverently, noting the careful organization of volumes by subject. Many spaces were empty, the books now gracing the schoolhouse shelves, but enough remained to reveal the breadth of Sarah Wilson's intellectual interests. "She was remarkable," Maggie said softly. "Yes," Sam agreed, his voice equally quiet. "She was." He moved to a cabinet in the corner, opening it to reveal a tea service. "Would you care for tea?" Sarah always said conversation flowed better with a cup in hand. The domestic gesture, so unexpected from this usually taciturn man, touched Maggie deeply. "I'd like that very much." While Sam prepared the tea with a methodical precision that suggested this had once been a regular ritual in this home, Maggie explored the study further. Framed pressed flowers, similar to those Sam had helped the children collect that morning, decorated one wall. A writing desk stood beneath the window, its surface clean but well used. And on a small table beside what must have been Sarah's reading chair sat a daguerreotype in a silver frame. Maggie hesitated, then gently lifted the frame for a closer look. The woman in the image had a heart-shaped face, intelligent eyes, and a smile that suggested she was sharing a private joke with the photographer. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, but her expression held such vivacity and warmth that Maggie immediately understood what had drawn Sam to her. "That was taken about a year before we came west," Sam said, returning with a tray bearing the tea service. Her father commissioned it as a wedding gift. "She looks kind," Maggie observed, carefully replacing the frame, "and spirited." "She was both," Sam confirmed, setting the tray on a small table. "Stubborn, too. Had to be, to survive out here in the early days." He paused, pouring the tea with careful movements. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in appearance, but in determination, the way you tackle problems head-on." The comparison startled Maggie. "I'm honored," she said sincerely. "From everything I've learned about her through her books and teaching notes, she was an extraordinary woman." Sam handed her a teacup, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "She would have approved of you," he said quietly. "Of what?" "You're doing with the school, with the children." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their tea as afternoon light filtered through the study windows. Finally, Sam set down his cup with a deliberate movement that suggested he had come to a decision. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice holding an unusual note of uncertainty. "The boarding house can't be ideal for a long-term living arrangement. Limited space, no privacy for preparing lessons or meeting with parents." Maggie looked at him curiously, unsure where this observation was leading. "Mrs. Fletcher has been very accommodating," she said carefully. "But you're right, it's not ideal for a permanent situation." Sam nodded, gaze fixed on some point beyond the window. "There's a cottage on the eastern edge of my property. Built it years ago for a foreman and his wife. He moved on to his own, spread last year. It's been sitting empty since." Maggie's heart began to beat a little faster, though she kept her expression neutral. "Oh, it's a good house," Sam continued, still not meeting her eyes directly. "2 bedrooms, proper kitchen, small parlor. About a mile from town, so not too far for your teaching duties. Could use a woman's touch, but the structure's sound." "It sounds lovely," Maggie replied, trying to understand exactly what he was proposing. Sam finally turned to look at her directly. "I'm not saying this right," he admitted, a rare flash of frustration crossing his features. "What I mean to say is, I'd like you to have it. The cottage. No rent, no obligations. Just a proper place for Pine Ridge's teacher to live and work." Maggie set down her teacup carefully, aware that this moment was pivotal. "That's extraordinarily generous, Sam. But I couldn't possibly accept such a gift without—" "It's not charity," he interrupted, reading her concern. "It's practical. The school needs a teacher who's settled, not someone living out of a carpet bag, in a temporary room. The cottage is just sitting there, going to waste." He paused, then added more softly, "And I'd rest easier knowing you had a proper home." The concern in his voice, the careful thought behind the offer, moved Maggie deeply. Yet she sensed there was something more beneath the practical reasoning he presented, something neither of them had yet found the courage to name directly. "May I see it?" she asked. "The cottage." Relief flickered across Sam's face. "Of course. We can ride over now, if you'd like." The cottage revealed itself to be everything Sam had described and more. A charming structure nestled among cottonwood trees, with a small front porch and windows that caught the late afternoon light. Inside, the rooms were well proportioned and thoughtfully designed, with built-in shelves, a sturdy cooking stove, and simple but quality furnishings. "It's beautiful," Maggie said honestly as they stood in the main room. "Far more than I ever expected to have in Pine Ridge." Sam watched her reaction carefully. "Then you'll accept it?" Maggie turned to face him directly. "Sam, I need to understand what this means. Is this merely a practical arrangement between neighbors? Or is it—" She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Is it something more?" The question hung between them, honest and unavoidable. Sam's expression shifted, revealing a vulnerability beneath his usual composed exterior. "When you arrived in Pine Ridge," he began slowly, "I had no intentions beyond simple kindness to a stranger in difficulty. I'd made my peace with solitude years ago." He looked around the cottage, then back to Maggie. "But these past months, watching you build a place for yourself here, seeing your strength and determination, it's woken something I thought was long finished." He moved closer, his weathered hands gentle as he took hers. "I'm not offering this cottage as a way to obligate you, Maggie. I'm offering it because I want you to stay in Pine Ridge, to have a home here, and yes, perhaps in time." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "In time, if you found yourself inclined toward deeper connections, I would welcome that. But there are no conditions attached to this roof over your head." Maggie's heart swelled with unexpected emotion. This careful, thoughtful declaration, so different from Thomas Blackwell's calculated proposal or the romantic platitudes of novels, felt profoundly real. Here was a man offering not empty promises or convenient arrangements, but the freedom to choose her own path while making clear his hopes for what that path might eventually include. "I think," she said softly, "that I would very much like to have this cottage as my home." She squeezed his hands gently. "And I think that in time, deeper connections would not be unwelcome." The smile that transformed Sam's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual warmth illuminating. He didn't rush to embrace her or declare passionate feelings. Instead, he simply nodded, the quiet joy in his eyes speaking volumes. "We'll take it slow," he said. "No need to rush what's worth building properly." 3 days later, Maggie moved. into the cottage with the help of several townspeople who had eagerly volunteered once word spread of her relocation. Harriet brought curtains she had sewn specifically for the cottage windows. Edward Jenkins delivered a housewarming gift of kitchen supplies and pantry staples. Even Mrs. Fletcher, though losing a paying boarder, contributed bed linens and a handmade quilt. Sam kept a respectful distance during the move, having already ensured the cottage was clean and in perfect repair. But as evening approached and the last helpers departed, he arrived with a final contribution, a rocking chair for the porch, handcrafted with the same care as the school cabinet. "Thought you might enjoy watching the sunset," he explained as they positioned it on the western side of the porch. "View of the mountains is particularly fine from here." As if to confirm his words, the sky began to paint itself in spectacular hues of orange, pink, and purple, the distant peaks silhouetted against the fading light. They stood side by side, comfortable in shared silence, watching nature's display. "I never imagined this," Maggie said finally. "When I boarded that train in Concord, when I received Thomas's rejection, I couldn't have conceived of this outcome." Sam nodded thoughtfully. Life rarely follows the trails we expect it to. Sometimes the unexpected turns lead to better destinations. Maggie glanced at him, this silver-haired rancher who had become so important to her in such a short time. He wasn't what she had journeyed west expecting to find. Not young, not conventionally handsome, not full of grand romantic gestures or promises. Yet in his quiet strength, his thoughtful actions, his respect for her independence and abilities, he had shown her a depth of character that no flowery letters could have revealed. "Better destinations indeed," she agreed softly. As the sunset faded into twilight, Sam reluctantly prepared to leave. "You'll be comfortable here?" he asked, the concern in his voice warming Maggie's heart. "Very," she assured him. "It already feels like home." He nodded, satisfied. "I'll stop by in a few days, see if anything needs attention." He hesitated, then added, "Sunday, if you're not otherwise engaged, I thought you might join me for dinner at the ranch. Nothing formal, just a meal shared." "I'd like that very much," Maggie replied. Sam reached for her hand, holding it briefly before bringing it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. "Until Sunday, then." As he rode away into the gathering darkness, Maggie remained on the porch, her new rocking chair creaking gently beneath her. The cottage lights behind her cast a warm glow into the night, the physical manifestation of the hope that now illuminated her future. She had come west seeking a husband, a home, a place to belong. The path to finding those things had been nothing like she'd imagined, filled with unexpected rejection, community support, and the slow, steady building of something genuine rather than the immediate fulfillment of romantic dreams. Thomas Blackwell had looked at her and seen only limitations, her age, her ordinary appearance, her practicality. Sam Wilson had looked deeper and recognized the strength, determination, and heart that made her who she truly was. As stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, Maggie Sullivan rocked gently on her porch and gave thanks for unanswered prayers and unexpected blessings. Sometimes, she reflected, the most precious gifts come not when someone tells us we're exactly what they want, but when they show us we're exactly who we need to be. The cottage creaked softly around her, the sound of a home settling into itself. In the distance, coyotes called to one another across the prairie, and in Maggie's heart, a certainty grew. Not of perfect endings, but of authentic beginnings, unfolding one thoughtful moment at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.